400 people in one room. We took sheets, you know, and made separations, you know, and it was a terrible situation.
So that was your first night?
That was our first night.
Ruth's family escaped to Shanghai and spent their first night in the refugee camp. Her father decided to rent a house nearby as their new home.
Straight into Hongkou, on Shushang Road, which is opposite the little park on Wayside, he found this little room. And the mildew, you know, from the rain and everything, the green, you know, was running down the walls. And Papa said, "It doesn't matter, but we three are alone."
New refugees kept coming, while living conditions in Shanghai kept deteriorating. The Committee for Assistance cabled New York, London, and Paris in April 1939. The overall number of Jewish refugees in Shanghai is 7,000. We're supporting 3,000. The funds can only last for 3 more weeks. 4,000 new refugees will arrive in Shanghai by the end of May. Unless we receive regular and reliable help immediately, we will have no choice but to give up. The refugees will soon face extreme hunger. We must use all political and economic means to eliminate the terrible impact on the entire community. The Shunbao newspaper also reported on the difficulties of refugee relief. 4,000 new refugees will arrive within the month. The Committee for Assistance is very anxious. Over 400 refugees shipped from Italy yesterday have been placed among the refugee camps. While Jewish refugees were struggling to earn a living in Shanghai, the situation in their homes was getting worse. Early in the morning of September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany launched a blitz against Poland. On September 3rd, the United Kingdom and France were forced to declare war on Germany, leading to the full-scale outbreak of the Second World War. Nazi Germany advanced on the battlefield and soon occupied Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Holland, and Belgium, one after the other. Persecution of Jews was also escalating. By the early summer of 1940, 3.2 million Jews had been arrested by the Nazis and imprisoned or sent to concentration camps.
There wasn't anybody else left that we could have relationships with. We did not find that out till after the war. And then Chinese. The English book was written first.
Betty wrote in her book, "No more thoughts of returning to Berlin to the old life and picking up where we left off. Everything was changing with terrifying speed." There was no way home, and their new lives were more difficult than they had expected. Fleeing to Shanghai may have appeared to be the worst choice at the time, but the city had become a land of hope and survival. The Japanese occupying authorities introduced new immigration rules in August 1939, restricting the number of refugees that could be admitted to Shanghai. Even the worst choice became more difficult. In June 1940, Italy declared war on Britain and France. That severed the maritime passage to Shanghai. The Shunbao newspaper reported on June 8, 1940. A total of 120 landed in Shanghai yesterday. This is the last group of refugees to come to Shanghai by way of the Suez Canal. By 1940, the number of European Jewish refugees in Shanghai exceeded 20,000. Some were transferred to other countries with the help of the JDC, but around 18,000 remained in Shanghai. In May 2015, Garden of the Righteous Among Nations in Israel. Engraved on the monuments in the garden are names of non-Jews who risked their lives during the Holocaust to save Jews from extermination by the Nazis. Just as in the Hall of Names, the name list of the righteous among the nations seems to stretch forever. The Chinese name, Ho Fung-shan was newly added. At the beginning of the Holocaust, Mr. Ho was consul general at the Chinese legation in Vienna. From his office in Vienna, Mr. Ho issued thousands of visas to Shanghai. They were called the visas of life.
Unter anderem durften sie emigrieren nach Nordamerika, Lateinamerika, nach Großbritannien, Niederlande, Belgien und auch nach China, nach Shanghai.
If Austrian Jews wanted to leave the country, they had to show a visa from the recipient country. The exact number of visas given by Ho to Jewish refugees remains unknown and is a matter of debate among researchers. Some honor him as the Oriental Schindler, while some raise doubts since the number of visas issued by Mr. Ho were not many.
One thing is clear. He gave an enormous amount of visas to Jews, which is probably something that no one expected him to do. As it says on the Medal of the Righteous, saving one person is saving an entire world. He saved thousands of worlds of people. Each person is a world unto itself.
On June 9, 2015, there was a party at West Palm Beach, Florida, in the United States. The guests attending the party were a dozen seniors who came from around the country. They shared a common identity. All are Jewish, and all had survived the Second World War in Shanghai.
Yes, I'd love to. I'm going to go back with him because I want to, now that I've been there with my father, I want to introduce my son to this part of our history.
We are family. Yeah, we are family. We feel like a family.
The hostess, Vera Sassoon, took out photos of previous gatherings. Though the people in these pictures are getting older and the crowd is getting thinner, the tradition of having annual gatherings has been preserved. They're not related by blood, but by the common experiences that connect them.
Everything is, yeah.
I remember everything about Shanghai.
Yeah. What little I can remember.
Many friends in Shanghai.
He was a baby.
Gerald, yeah.
Yeah.
I still keep in touch with my friends from Shanghai in the street where we lived, and in a lane, a street number was Changyang Lu, number 24 lane was a police station. On the corner was a police station, and we were on the third floor, looking right into the police station.
It was 70 years ago and 10,000 miles away, but they remember that Shanghai made the difference between life and death.
Every day going to school and have to see dead people on the street, that was my worst thing, to see those poor people suffering so much, dying from malnutrition and all that.
Sometimes I remember going after air raid out in the street and see a lot of people hurt and dying, and Chinese people and Jewish people, all dying, very seriously hurt.
Walk anywhere, you would see little children rolled up in straw mats, little babies that families couldn't afford to bury them, and that was a daily occurrence. That was, sad and very upsetting to see that, as a child, to see that.
When they came to Shanghai in 1939, China was in the third year of the counter-Japanese war. Though the Chinese fought dauntlessly in bloody battles, almost half the country had fallen to Japan. Except for the international settlement and the French concession, the rest of Shanghai was controlled by the Japanese military. However, in March 1939, the Japanese forced the Shanghai Municipal Council to sign what was called the Detailed Agreement on Peacekeeping in the Shanghai International Settlement. This gave the Japanese military the right to rule the settlement. Meanwhile, it used Shanghai as a base to tighten its control on goods and materials in the occupied areas of the country. Every day, new refugees flocked into Shanghai. Life became hardly bearable. On the night of August 20th, 1939, desperate famine victims stormed the rice shops and transport trucks, triggering mass plunder. Seeing this, Jewish refugees were seized by panic. Shanghai was their last chance. Should they be deported again, they would have nowhere to go. Steve Hostad is a professor at the Illinois College in Jacksonville. His grandparents were among the first group of Jewish refugees to flee from Vienna, and they went into exile in Shanghai. For more than 30 years, Steve has dedicated himself to the study of the Holocaust and the history of Jewish refugees in Shanghai.
When they landed at Shanghai, they had to get on a truck, the back of an open truck, and be driven to a place, the Embankment Building, which is across the Suchow Creek, where they could stay for a couple of days. But this was set up for them. They had beds to stay in, they were given meals, and then the first ones were able to begin to find apartments in Shanghai. But then when more and more and more came, it was harder and harder to find apartments, harder and harder to find work. Out of these 18,000 who came, perhaps 3,000 were never able to find their own apartment.
Jewish refugees have been coming to take refuge in Shanghai as early as 1938, and the numbers had just kept growing. On January 18, 1939, Shunbao newspaper reported that the number of Jewish refugees in Shanghai was huge, but that a few of them managed to make a living without the Committee for Assistance's help by selling their jewelry. Meanwhile, the committee had realized that simply offering free food and accommodation could never solve the problem of the refugees' survival. So they arranged for refugees to get skill training, enabling them to work as carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, hairdressers, and bakers. Some even started their own businesses.
My mother brought things that she knew she would never use in Shanghai. She brought nice linens and laces and crystals and all kinds of art objects, whatever nice things she had. And when we got there, we were put up by the American Joint Distribution Committee. So my mother took all these items to the thrift shop, and with that money, she did two things. She bought an apartment in the French concession, and my father had studied to be a typewriter mechanic. She went to Sichuan Road and found a little office, hired a Chinese mechanic, and they set up a typewriter business.
Evelyn recalls that their main customers were French, British, and Americans, occasionally Japanese and Chinese. Back in Germany, her family was engaged in typewriter repairing and knew the business thoroughly. The business did quite well under the management of Evelyn's mother. Shanghai is an immigrant city inhabited by people from all walks of life. The arrival of the European Jews added a new people to the mix. Ruth's father, once the owner of a high-end shoe store, began to sell jam.
My father, my papa, was selling in these camps, refugee camps, jam. He took a little thing and put a couple of jams, and my mom was crying what had become of us. My papa, he was selling jam, but people bought, so we had to pay for the rent. And that is how he started.
Betty's father took two jobs at the same time. While selling medicine, he also did paperwork for a Chinese company. Perhaps Betty was too young at the time, or perhaps her parents kept things from her, but she rarely felt afraid.
I used to buy the rice in a sack on the black market during the war, you know, and there were a lot of bugs in there. We had this windowsill in our room, and we put the rice on there, and the bugs would come crawling out. And my sister would sit on one end, and I would sit on the other end, and the one who got the most bugs won the game. And then it was a game.
Remembering a childhood game, Betty is full of cheer. She's lucky now to have many children and grandchildren. Compared to her relatives who died in Nazi concentration camps, she is lucky to be alive.
Well, we played with children in the lane, you know. They don't know the meaning of the word anti-Semitism. They just accepted us. They just took us in. While we did not become lifelong friends, we felt comfortable with them.
What impressed me most was the welcome we received in Shanghai, how the people received us. We were the Nakonis and they received us, they were happy with us, and we were respected. We were respected.
This is Mr. Chu, my mother, little sister.
In 1939, Vera's family, a total of 17 people, fled from Austria to Shanghai. They lived in Kunming Road. The little sister Vera mentioned was their neighbor, Mr. Zhou's daughter.
In his later years. And Mr. Chu would say to my parents, he said, you know, and he always made sure that when I came home from school, that I stopped off at his home and had a meal with them. And then I would end up playing with his daughter, and it was really, for me, it was really a wonderful time. And it's still, the memories are still there. And as I said, Mr. Chu was this wonderful man who more or less adopted me.
Leaving Shanghai in 1949, Vera has returned several times to look for Mr. Zhou's family, but without success. In 2011, she came back to Shanghai for the third time, and this time she asked for help from Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. She left them Mr. Zhou's photo.
昨天来沪寻人的73岁犹太老人维拉，在各方的帮助下，终于找到了60多年前好心邻居周先生的后人。今天，维拉和周先生的女儿岳阳视频通电话，两位老人聊起陈年往事，依然如儿时般亲密。
维拉姐姐，我叫你姐姐可以吗
She's not calling you a sister, elder sister. You know, you're just like a sister to her.
My little sister. We're still the same two little girls. In our hearts, we're still the same two little girls.
She called the museum and she said she was watching television and she saw me being interviewed with a photo of her father, and she said, "That's my father." So then they arranged for a Skype interview, which was heartwarming.
现在是非常激动的。可惜的，我父亲就是在2001年的时候没了。要是我父亲在的话，哎呀，我父亲也这个简直是不敢相信了，就是说这个事情。
Zhou Huizhen's father, Zhou Zhiji, worked for the British American Tobacco Company's Shanghai office. He spoke fluent English and introduced many customers to Vera's father.
I was really the envy of all my schoolmates because here was this man picking me up to take me home, and everybody wanted to run to him, "No, take me home, and he said, "No, I wait for my missy," and he only took me home.
我们过春节嘛，就是在家里面吃饭呀，接着吃饭，吃年夜饭，什么东西都是他们来吃的，3个人。 我们中国人嘛，就是一些鱼啊、肉了、什么菜了什么的，哎，我们家维拉都是放学的时候到我们家每天吃点心的，什么赤豆汤。打好了啊，希望能。
On June 14, 2015, Zhou Huizhen and Vera video chatted again.
But tell your grandmother I can't wait for us to, well, I'm not much of a cook, but I can't wait for her to make the bean soup, okay? And hopefully in my kitchen in America, so hopefully she'll come and visit.
Her room is already all made.
这阿姨刚弄完给咱准备好了。这阿姨，要不侬看1、2年了，还都没有人光照片了，上网都已经搬了海了。
Can you see? Ask if they can see it.
侬看得出来？
Not being able to see Mr. Zhou again is an everlasting regret for Vera. She yearns to sit together with her little sister again and drink a bowl of sweet red bean soup, just like in the old days.
Of my cousin that Mr. Wu tried to save. She drew this for my parents when she was 10 years old.
So you keep it all the way.
Although this is home. She was murdered when she was 22 by the Nazis.
Like Vera, Ruth also thinks about a special Shanghai friend, Mr. Wu. In the second half of 1939, Ruth's father started in the fabric trade instead of the jam business. Selling fabrics on the street, he met Mr. Wu, who was in the import-export business.
He will give him space. He had the 3-4 room office. So he said, 1 room, I will build you a little cabinet with glass doors, and I will tell everybody here that you are selling in my office. He made us live again.
Ruth remembers Mr. Wu as being very rich and speaking excellent English. Mr. Wu vastly improved the family's situation.
And so he said one day, I want you to go out of Hongkou. So he took us to wife number 2. On the top floor, a beautiful, large room with a balcony and sunshine and a real bathroom with a bathtub and a toilet. Oh my God, we thought we were in heaven, And wife number 2, you saw, she was a simple woman, but very nice, very nice. And so that is how, through this way, Mr. Wu, I got to the famous Shanghai Jewish School.
At what is now 500 North Shanxi Road was the Shanghai Jewish School at the time. Ruth was one of the students there. She spent many years at the school.
This school is with me for my whole life.